Nós não passamos a mão na cabeça de ninguém.
Eu sou favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso.
Eu sei o que é passar fome.
Imagine that Lula could send me to puta que pariu.
Since 2013, Brazil has lived under continuous political turmoil. First, a wave of protests swept the country, showing the political establishment just how much Brazilians wanted change. In the following year, the federal police launched Operation Car Wash, which evolved into the largest anti-corruption investigation in Brazilian history and has tarnished the reputations of all major parties. The political scenario was ideal for change, some analysts predicted a couple of years ago. But we have seen the opposite of that. Congress changed the rules in order to favor big parties and establishment candidates in the elections, and we should expect one of the lowest levels of renewal this upcoming election. One of the side effects of that is a general lack of faith in Brazilian institutions. As we have published in the Brazilian Report weeks ago, Brazilians live in an era of mistrust. We don't trust the government, we don't trust companies, heck, we don't even trust one another. So, as Brazilians head to the polls in 2.5 weeks, we've got to ask, what's the state of the Brazilian democracy? My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, and this is Explaining Brazil. With me in our studios in São Paulo is Diogo Rodrigues. Hello, Diogo.
Hello, Gustavo.
And joining us over the phone is Felipe Campanti, a Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor at Johns Hopkins University. Professor, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Professor, you co-wrote an article published by O Globo newspaper on September 11th, saying, and I quote, "Brazil's political elite is playing with fire and putting democracy at a great risk." What risk are you talking about?
Well, I think it's a risk that until very recently seemed to be, a thing of the past in Brazil. And it's a risk that could have, like a institutional breakdown and a breakdown of democracy, that we could actually have, an old school coup, I think, is in the cards, within a range of, many possibilities of institutional disruption that, once again, if you had asked me 5 or 6 years ago, I would have, thought were completely out of the picture, completely irrelevant for thinking about the Brazilian political system. But now I'm afraid that we're back to the days where, thinking and speculating about what, military officers think of the order of the day.
And how much of that is the responsibility of the rise of the far right in Brazil? Would you say that that's a main factor?
Well, I would say the rise of the far right is a symptom more than sort of the cause of that instability. I think the fault for that dismal scenario that we see outlined in front of us right now is of the political establishment, as you were, mentioning in the introduction to this podcast, in that it's been very clear that the Brazilian public, the Brazilian citizens, voters are extremely dissatisfied with the performance of the political system, with good reason, with all that has been revealed in terms of the inner workings of that system and the degree of corruption and sort of the lack of accountability. And as you pointed out as well, what we have seen is actually the establishment just trying to push through and protect itself and being completely impervious to sort of any kind of renewal through institutional means. As we point out, Cláudio Ferraz and Rodrigo Soares, who co-wrote that opinion piece that you mentioned, so the candidates that the parties have presented this year, for the most part, are just the same people who have been running for years and years and years. So it's just an illustration at the presidential level. But if you go down to the congressional level and even the states, you see the very, very same thing. So I think the total absence of a response in terms of offering alternatives within the mainstream of Brazilian politics has opened the door for the frustration to manifest itself in disenchantment with democracy, and that's what has put us in this, what I think is a perilous situation.
We have now the frontrunner for the election, Mr. Jair Bolsonaro, who has multiple times called into question the legitimacy of our electronic voting system. And we have his VP nominee, which has taken the front seat right now because he's still recovering from a September 6th stabbing, saying that we should change our constitution and not necessarily have a constitution drafted by people elected by the Brazilian voters. What risk, in your opinion, this candidacy, which is polling at first, I must remember, represents for Brazilian democracy?
I think it's a real risk. Clearly, Bolsonaro is not committed to democracy as a concept and as a matter of principle. You know, one of the things that I find quite remarkable, actually, watching and sort of following this electoral cycle from the United States, and, you know, with the experience of having seen the rise of Trump over the last couple of years, is how much of a resemblance there is between Bolsonaro and Trump, both in the sense that the sort of establishment, the political and the opinion elites were very much taken by surprise and kept expecting their candidacies to collapse, but also, and I think to the point that we're raising right now, that they haven't ever tried to fool anyone, really, in terms of their vision and their lack of commitment with respect to sort of the standard norms of behavior in our respective democracy. So I think, you know, they've been saying loud and clear, both Bolsonaro and, you know, his campaign and his vice presidential running mate, and we should believe him. I think that's the bottom line, and that clearly indicates a risk.
You mentioned Trump, and I want to make a parallel because in the United States, despite all the negative news cycles surrounding the White House, it seems like the economy is running and they are at full employment, and they even have a problem of an overheating of the economy. So a lot of Brazilian markets, for instance, financial markets, expect kind of the same thing, that they don't see Mr. Bolsonaro as a threat, and that's why he has become, for investors, the better option. How do you see that gamble?
Well, I think that and I think that goes both for the U.S. and for Brazil. The short-run rhythms of the economy, they are much less, you know, they're not as directly and sort of deterministically affected by political developments. So I think what's happened in the U.S. is sort of an erosion of institutional norms and sort of the institutional backbone of the American democracy. But that's not something that is going to translate into a recession in the next quarter. It can perfectly well coexist with an economic boom, and that's been the case, you know, many times over history in many different countries, where we had erosions of democracy coexisting with economic booms. So I don't think there's anything surprising about that. And so in that sense, the market, if we might keep using that generic label, doesn't really care about this sort of longer-term institutional framework. So I don't think there's any paradox in the coexistence of, you know, good economic times and very problematic political developments.
Professor, do you think that our institutions are strong enough to prevent authoritarian and anti-democratic measures in the case Bolsonaro wins?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, let me put it this way. I don't think that it's a sure thing that, democratic backsliding is going to happen and they're going to have a coup. I wouldn't even say that it's the most likely outcome. But I don't see sort of the Brazilian democracy in a good position, especially after, 5 years of fraying and tension. I don't see the Brazilian democracy in a good position to respond to, the kind of tests that I think could be put in front of it. So I think, if you just think about the level of confidence in Congress or in traditional parties or sort of in the whole political establishment, it's an extremely weak. It's a political establishment that lacks any kind of credibility. So I don't think the defenses of the Brazilian democracy right now are in good shape. So that's what makes me concerned about the next few years. And I think that's something that it's a kind of instability that is going to be around for a while. I really don't see any result of this election clarifying and sort of doing away with that instability.
And how can Brazilian politics be reformed? What are the alternatives? And how do we convince the very people that benefit from the current system to change the system?
Yeah, so that is the key challenge, right? That is sort of the catch-22. And, as become very clear, the people who have risen through this system and who have benefited from the system, they are doing everything in their power, across the political and ideological spectrum to, prevent things from changing. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. So it's kind of almost a cliche by now to talk about like political reform, but that doesn't mean that it's not necessary. And the one thing that I think is sort of the main challenge that we see right now is, it's a couple of related challenges. So one is exactly sort of the lack of openness that we see within sort of the mainstream political system, as you pointed out. So there's sort of the way the let's say, campaign financing is structured right now, and this is actually something that has likely gotten worse with the recent reforms in campaign financing, is how concentrated this is in the hands of the sort of political caciques, right? And that's something that is very much at the heart of our problem, as well as sort of this idea that is sort of encapsulated in the foro privilegiado, right? The special treatment given to a whole host of politicians, which actually really distorts selection into political positions, right? You have people who are running for office pretty much with the intent of protecting themselves from justice, right? So, things like eliminating the foro privilegiado, kind of reforming campaign finance in a way that I think makes it more responsive to to individual citizens, right? Having something built around individual contributions with strong limits. So all of these are I think, measures that could help, but always going in the direction of, I think, taking power away from the current cartel that runs Brazilian politics and kind of opening things up for competition. But now, as you rightly pointed out, that goes against the incentives of the leaders of these cartels, right, to kind of give away their power. So I think we must consider some sort of transition formula, right, as, unfair as it might seem, where some sort of protection is given to current politicians. So let's say we try to sort of offer some transition formula, let's say away from foro privilegiado, for instance, right, where the Congress that is being elected right now has some sort of protection kind of going into the future. As I said, it's not the most appealing from a justice perspective, but we need to do something just to get out of this equilibrium in a way that is compatible with democracy and with the continued development of Brazilian institutions. So we do need political reform, kind of in the direction that I've tried to outline here, but trying to make the incentives, to align the incentives by providing some sort of, basically by buying off, to be blunt about it, the current political elites, because otherwise I think, the risk of, extra institutional, change, of an institutional breakdown, I think, has increased, and it will continue to increase.
And do you think that after the election, no matter what the result is there any possibility of a dialogue of, at least appeasing the polarization that we have seen in the last few years?
Well, I certainly hope. I wouldn't say I'm particularly optimistic about it, but I hope that, perhaps hope against hope, that there will be sort of the perception of how bad things are getting, and perhaps the current political establishment could see what's at stake and kind of try to kind of find a way out of this. Now, I think a big problem as far as the post-election prospects are concerned is that usually it's easier to get political change going kind of in this more controlled way when the economic times aren't as bad, right? The problem is that in Brazil right now, to sort of make the economic side, to turn around the economic side, we need measures that are hard, many of them are politically difficult, and then we're in a bit of a catch-22 where to kind of improve the economic situation right now, I think that there's the need for kind of some strong policy making that becomes particularly hard in the context of a lack of legitimacy and a lack of credibility of the political system. So I think that is a very important challenge.
Allow me to interrupt you, but we have seen in this past couple of days some actions that show that at least the two major parties, the Workers' Party and the Social Democracy Party, are willing to establish a dialogue, something that has not happened in recent years. For instance, 2014, the very first thing that the Social Democracy did was to challenge the electoral result. And now both parties are admitting to work with one another. We have seen the Workers' Party candidate admitting to the possibility of reforming the pension system, something that the party has spent the last couple of years saying that, well, Brazil didn't need to. So isn't there, or am I being too naive to be optimistic about these gestures?
Well, I think these are certainly positive gestures, and I think any way out of the current situation would involve something like that. What I think remains to be seen is whether the current leadership of these parties, and, you can bring to the table kind of sort of the other, main players of sort of Brazilian, the Brazilian political mainstream, if you will, whether they have what it takes to pull that off, right? Because I think the last few years and all of the corruption scandals and all of the political instability have really kind of eroded the ability of parties to sort of represent, voters and kind of respond to what voters want. So I certainly hope that, I think these are signs in a positive direction, but they must be made sustainable, and they must be made, they won't be enough if they are not sort of backed by an increased kind of credibility and legitimacy, and it remains to be seen kind of how the current, the parties as they are constituted can deliver that. But again, I definitely agree that to the extent that the political forces that are committed to democracy get together and are willing to compromise in order to sort of stave off a bigger institutional threat, I think this is obviously a positive development from that perspective.
And we always talk about the problems with the politicians, but what's the role of Brazilian voters, of Brazilian citizens and all that? Because in 2013 there was a wave of protests, and Congress kind of responded to that. But then it faded away. What should we do? How we become ourselves actors and we become ourselves active in this process of holding politicians accountable?
Well, one of my main interests in terms of research is exactly sort of this type of political activity, political protest and the like, which are kind of very costly from an individual perspective. It's very hard to coordinate. So it's very hard to sustain that kind of mobilization over time. So the answer has to be, again, sort of at least in large part, in mainstream kind of political participation, just voting, right? And here is where I think a big place to look at are the congressional elections this year, right? So if we see that the same politicians who are, credibly accused and very, very sort of clearly involved with corruption and misgovernance, et cetera, if these people are reelected, and to be honest, right now I'm pretty pessimistic. I think that a lot of them are going to be reelected. Then that's an indication that we as voters are not doing our part in terms of trying to renew Brazilian democracy. I mean, there are a lot of structural reasons why this happens, but I think if you ask me, like, what could voters do? Well, they should, pay attention and try to hold politicians accountable kind of on a day-to-day basis, right? Think about who you're going to vote for, try to hold these people accountable, and that's something that I think, there's a lot of room for improvement in the Brazilian democracy, right? So we need to kind of get out of the cycle where people are disenchanted with democracy, therefore they kind of tune out and they are disengaged, and that just makes politicians even less accountable, which kind of feeds off this disengagement cycle. We need to jump out of that vicious circle. We need to try to get to a different equilibrium with more engagement, more accountability, and that's what's going to strengthen Brazilian democracy.
And since we're talking about lack of engagement, what do you think that this apathy of the Brazilian voters, what can be the effect of this apathy in this election specifically, and in the second round of the election that seems to be pointing to a polarization between the Workers' Party and Jair Bolsonaro?
I think it can be decisive. I think not only at the presidential level or at the majoritarian elections. So part of that apathy is going to translate, I think, in a worse Congress, or in a Congress that is as bad as the current Congress. But it can also affect, it's very easy to see how this will affect, or could potentially affect, the outcome of the presidential election, right? So this idea that, everything's all the same, and I think there's a lot of people who kind of feel very much unimpressed by all the alternatives that are currently being presented, and to the extent that these people say, then I'm going to disengage, that is going to potentially affect the election outcomes. I think this is going to be a very, very big part of what's going to happen here. How abstention, how kind of null and blank votes are going to shape up. I think this is all going to be like a big part of the story in this election.
Well, we'll know the answer in 2.5 weeks. Professor, thank you very much for joining us for this podcast, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please take a look at our website. It's Brazilian.report. Every day we have new content about Brazil's politics, economics, and society. We also have exclusive newsletter services if you want to be briefed on what's going on in Brazil before starting your day. Subscribe now to our free trial and enjoy all of our content for 14 days. It's really free and you don't have to put any credit card information before subscribing. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle is @BrazilianReport. That's all for now. See you next week.